Hey everybody, welcome back to chapter 28, the Affluent Society. I guess we're not back. I guess we're starting on what looks to be, hope maybe, who knows, the last full chapter we're going to be covering this year. So obviously we'll stay praised of all that. But this is going to be kind of our last, at least for the time, it appears our last chapter for the year. So this is kind of an interesting one. It gets into a lot of cultural attitudes and things. It's actually one of my favorite chapters of the book because we talk about the lifestyle in the 1950s and 60s and how we start to see really the modern America that we recognize today. Lots of lots of aspects of that are going to be examined here in this chapter. Uh, one of the things that one of the things that we don't see that I'm not really going to talk about a whole lot actually has to do with vaccines and vaccinations and stuff. By the 1950s, we see a lot of the common vaccines that you get tested for or you get vaccinated for when you're born become available for widespread use for things like tetanus shots. I need one, by the way. It's been since 1994 since I had a tetanus shot. So I think you're supposed to get those every 10 years, so I'm overdue. Anyway, yeah, so for like tetanus and tuberculosis and um, whooping cough and the polio vaccine was a big deal, as you'll hopefully read about in the chapter, um, and smallpox and all that stuff. So we see vaccinations as kind of a big part there. All right. So anyway, obviously this chapter is called the Affluent Society. So we're talking about wealth and influence and how that changes during the 1950s. So let's get into that a little bit. All right. So the first thing I want to explain is kind of a difficult and confusing concept. It's going to be something called Keynesian economic theory. John Maynard Keynes was an economist during the 1920s, starting in the 1920s. Um, and comes up with a new economic theory. Okay, now prior to him, there's kind of two competing economic theories. There's Adam Smith that he put out in The Wealth of Nations in the late 1700s that boasts the support for a free market economy, laissez-faire. Everybody should be able to make as much money as they want, but they also run the risk of failure. That's how free market economy works. And of course, Marxism, which is a command economic system. Keynesian economic theory is a little bit different, and it's something that at various times in our country's modern history we've subscribed to. Keynesian economic theory basically um, talks about um, government intervention in the economy to keep it growing. Now, yes, that sounds a little bit but like communism, but it's really not. Okay, so let me explain why. In Keynesian economics, um, Keynes argues that we should intervene in the economy by pumping money into things like New Deal programs to regulate the economy to keep it moving to prevent a major downfall. He also advocates that when times are doing really good, that we should scale back those economic aspects to prevent high inflation. Okay, so if that makes sense. So basically, say the economy is not doing good, increase regulations to put more money into the economy to take care of people, kind of like a little bit kind of like the stimulus package that we're getting because of coronavirus. Okay, if you know about that, hopefully, since there's nothing else to do, I imagine you've been watching the news a little bit. Um, but then the problem is when you pump too much money into the economy and you start to get surpluses, then the inflation rate goes up. When the inflation rate goes up, that means the value of money, the value of your individual dollar goes down. Think about when we talked about silver and gold back in chapter 19, when I talked about the pile of gold, you add silver to it, and then everybody's portion is worth less, even though there's enough for everybody. Okay, so when the inflation rate goes up, you want to scale back on some of those regulations and the production of money to prevent the inflation rate from going too high. You never want to have a zero inflation rate, but once it starts to get like above 5% or something like that, then you have to kind of be nervous. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. If not, we'll talk about it in Zoom this week. Okay. We also have a very interesting society during the 1950s. We learned in chapter 27 that the economy, we learned in chapter 27 that people are certainly terrified of communism, and the government is, doing everything it can to detract the idea of communism to be popular amongst American people. Okay, what this means in the 1950s is we really don't want people to kind of be outside what the social norm is. That, for instance, is why people, when he first comes out, aren't too thrilled about sexy Elvis over there. Look at that. Look at those hips shaking. Sexy man. That's on tape, too. That's too bad. Anyway, so what we have is kind of a weird society in the 1930s where people don't want to be their own person because you'll be afraid you could be ostracized by society. Remember, we're living in a world in the 1950s where Robin Hood is being banned from libraries because robbing from the rich and giving to the poor sounds communist, and we hate communism. Okay, so there's certainly, again, different groups of society that aren't thrilled about the direction that our country's going. Okay, one example, right, is a book by William White um, called The Organization Man. Okay, The Organization Man basically is a book that says um, that men have given up on the ideal of individualism in order to fit in more with society. Okay, in other words, teamwork makes the dream work. Don't be your own man because that might label you as different, and you don't want to be different because if you're different, you're a communist. Okay, that's the idea behind something like the Organization Man. Other books too come out. There's another one that's mentioned in the textbook. There's another good book from the late 50s, early 60s called The Split Level Trap, which is basically split level is like a tri-level home. You see them all over Kettering and Centerville. Um, and the idea was since everybody's kind of pursuing the suburban lifestyle and everybody wants to have goods and consumer things and everybody wants to have the same houses and stuff, kind of the same idea in the split level trap that the individual man, the rugged individualism that we so often celebrate in America, is being lost to again fall in line with the I want to fit in with everybody and be part of the group mentality. All right. What are some other detractors? Okay. One of the biggest groups here is the Beat Generation. The Beat Generation is kind of an interesting group. Um, I'm actually in Cleveland right now. I'm at my dad's house, and my dad likes the some of the writings from the Beat Generation, but he's downstairs sleeping right now. So I'd like to bring him in to talk, but I don't want to wake him up. So whatever. Anyway, so the Beat Generation was kind of like the hippies before there were the hippies. And basically, their argument is they don't want any part of this modern society that has no place for youth, that has no opportunity for individuality and self-expression. Many of the members of the Beat Generation their um, are in their 20s, right? Some of them college dropouts, some of them never went to college, some of them are college graduates. They uh, are frustrated with modern society, right? They believe modern society is terrible. Okay, I don't know that I agree with it so much. I think they're just a bunch of whiners, but whatever. My dad's sleeping, so he can't hear me say that. Anyway, uh, so Allen Ginsberg, for instance, writes this Howl that just critiques modern society. Is so focused, essentially, I know the book says other stuff, but modern society is so focused on consumer goods and consumer things and having the latest car and the newest home and all this stuff is so important that we're a morally bankrupt society. Uh, Part of the argument of the Beat Generation is that, right? They want nothing to do with life as they see it existing in this modern framework. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so Beat Generation, they don't want anything to do with society as it is, and they just want to be out of it. They drop out of it. Most notable, the kind of the leader of the whole movement was a guy named Jack Kerouac. He wrote the book, the Bible of the Beat Generation, a book called On the Road, where he and his friends just travel across the country and talk about or kind of who they find and what they experience, and just shows us that everything isn't really the world that the government and everybody else wants you to believe it is. Another example is the famous book Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. This book, it comes out in the late 1953, I think. Has this main character Holden Caulfield, who's just always miserable and upset because he can't seem to find a place in the world that he is willing to accept or is willing to accept him. Okay, again, in general, talking about these folks here, no place for us in society, no comfort. This facade of a great society that we're supposed to be living in, an affluent society, really maybe isn't all that great. We also see the preponderance of juvenile delinquency during the 1950s. Movies like Blackboard Jungle, Rebel Without a Cause is another popular one, where it kind of purports this myth of juvenile delinquents, that these kids are really bad and they're all doing bad things and vandalism and getting in fights with switchblades and all this stuff. It wasn't really that bad. Kids then were probably no worse than we were than you guys are when I was a kid. But we're in a different world now. It's the 1950s. Teenagers have cars now for the first time. People are living in suburbs in great numbers for the first time. So it's a different world. And when we see a different world, older people tend to not embrace it all that much. Okay, so again, that's how we kind of describe this restless culture of youth with any generation. We don't want to be like the people older than us, so we try to find our way to rebel. In the 50s, it's the Beats and the juvenile delinquents and whatnot. In the 60s, it's the hippies. In the 70s, it's weird stuff. Another big thing that is going to impact society during the 1950s is the emergence of rock and roll, and of course, its first great star, Elvis. Okay, so Elvis, of course, is the first big rock and roll star. He's not the first ever rock and roll star, though, which generally regarded as the first rock and roll song is a song called Rock Around the Clock, and that's how rock and roll gets its name. Just like Rapper's Delight is the first ever rap song, and it's called rap music because the first song was called Rapper's Delight in 1979. Fun fact. Anyway, so Elvis isn't actually the first one. There's a song called Rock Around the Clock by a band called Bill Haley and the Comets, which first introduces us to rock and roll music. Elvis, of course, comes along shortly after, and because of his hip gyrations and good looks and all this stuff, he becomes a big sensation and really puts rock and roll on the map here in the mid 1950s. You'll notice if you research rock and roll a little bit, the music really has African American origins. Innovations in guitar sounds, many of that come from African American artists, people like Muddy Waters and others. It's a different form of music that, of course, was only in 1950s America was only going to become popular if it was sung by a white man. Okay, and Elvis was kind of the perfect person for this. He grew up singing in gospel choirs and um, in Memphis, Tennessee, which is a very black, racially mixed area of the country. So he's able to get a lot of that experience with African Americans and is able to bring this sound, which is in many ways originated by blacks, to a mainstream audience. And then that, of course, later allows other black performers like Chubby Checker Little Richard, Chuck Berry to become stars in their own right. All right. Let's talk a little bit about kind of the other side of America and talk about poverty here for a little bit, which is a really interesting topic to talk about, I think. Okay, so as much as we want to glorify in the 1950s the affluent society and the wealth and the happiness and all the good stuff that everybody's experiencing, picture me holding the flag yelling America right now. Um, but I can't do that, so whatever. Uh, there's also people that aren't having that same experience. And an author by the name of Michael Harrington exposes us to this in the early 1960s with his book called The Other America, which talks about poverty. Okay, and ultimately helps to create one of the biggest social movement, or well, one of the biggest political movements of the 1960s, which is the War on Poverty that Lyndon Johnson leads. Now, what this book argues about is that we haven't actually eradicated the poverty issue in America during this period of affluence. In fact, we still have an amount, a number of people, as many as 20% in the population, that suffer from poverty. Now, the basic governmental belief with all the expansion, the economic expansion that we're experiencing in the 50s, would be that it would wipe out poverty. With more and more consumer goods being out there and more jobs being created, we're creating a ton of jobs in the 1950s, by the way, through expansion militarily. We build the freeways, the interstate system in the 1950s, which creates tens of thousands of jobs. Malls come around in the 1950s, so you have retail centers, so there's lots of more jobs for women too that are out there. So we're expanding a great deal during this time. And we figure with all the jobs out there, it's just going to eventually get rid of poverty. And that's what we're led to believe in the 1950s. But the reality is still that, 20%, 20% poverty rate in an America that talks about how good things are economically is really, really a bad thing. By comparison, our poverty rate today is, I believe, somewhere around 13%. I can be wrong about that, but it usually hovers around there nowadays. This gets us to bring up kind of this topic of poverty a little bit more. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense to you. A really high poverty rate, 1 out of 5 people in poverty is pretty bad. And this book and movements in the country, especially during the 1960s, say we got to do something about it. Okay, especially in rural areas. When we think of poverty, what do we think of? Poor people living in poor neighborhoods in inner cities, basically the places that were affected by the tornadoes, the Memorial Day tornadoes in Dayton last year, if you've ever been around there. But some of the worst poverty is what you find in rural areas. You ever drive up 75 and you drive past places where there's all these old barns or silos that are all rusted out, or barns that are falling apart? That's rural poverty. They're not just sitting there because nobody lives there. They're sitting there in those conditions because the people don't have the money to get them fixed, right? As agriculture becomes increasingly more commercial, people in rural areas, lose more and more um, as farmers, as farming becomes more and more an out of vogue profession for people. So this is a really, really big issue and a really big challenge and problem for us here. But you also have to consider, right? It's not just poverty in the cities. We're talking about poverty in rural areas too that are kind of exposed during this time. Now let's talk about poverty in the inner cities. So what happens, and this is how the cycle of poverty exists. Um, and it's one of those things, I can't save the world, but one of the things that if I had a ton of money, that I would really work to do is to find a real solution to inner city poverty and opportunities, and why we call the cycle of poverty. Okay, so let me explain this to you, right? So It used to be everybody lived in the cities. That was the place to be. It's actually becoming that way again a little bit as we're kind of regentrifying areas and making them nice. We can talk about this more in Zoom. But so what you have here is during the 1950s, all the people that have money that had lived in the cities are now moving out because they don't want to live in a nice apartment anymore with no land. They want to have a home with a yard and all these things. So they move out of the inner city, smaller areas, and move out to the suburbs. With them comes businesses and things of that nature, right? So imagine a city, a big city. Imagine Dayton or Cincinnati or whatever. Everybody with money kind of moves out to Centerville and Kettering and Oakwood. Okay. If I own a store downtown, I'm going to say, boy, all my clients are leaving. So I better move to, if I'm a Kroger, I better move out to Kettering or something like that and open up a store there. Okay. Or if I have a restaurant, I better open up a store out there. So what that means is we have empty storefronts. Okay. Um, if I own a apartment complex, right, and this is the cycle of poverty, folks. So if I own an apartment complex, right, and all of a sudden everybody moves out to go live in the suburbs, well, I need to make money for my family, so I need to fill my apartment with people. Okay, the only way to do that now is to lower my prices. What happens when I lower my prices? Well, it attracts people that can afford to pay. And in many cases, these are minorities, these are less educated, these are people with limited opportunities or experience. And they go and they live in my place for less money. Okay. Now I'm suddenly making less, right? So I have to cut back in certain areas because I got my own family to take care of, right? So maybe I can't keep up maintenance on my building as good as I used to because I got to, maintain enough money to take care of my family and whatever. And so suddenly the building falls into disrepair. It's not very nice, right? So then it suddenly becomes even less desirable place to live. This could be an apartment building, it could be a home, whatever. I don't take care of these areas, and the place gets worse and worse. Okay, since the people that are now living in the city don't have as much money, they don't have jobs that pay as well. They can't go to the stores and the restaurants and the places to buy um, food and to buy new clothes and to take their family out to a meal. They can't go to the theater and enjoy those things that our middle class or wealthier people used to enjoy while living in the cities. What does this mean? More closures, less money, so on and so forth. That's why it's so hard to get inner city areas out of this cycle of poverty. Okay, because when you pull people out, they get replaced by the same people, meaning poor people, people with limited social mobility and opportunity. And that's a really big problem in this country. And it's one we continue to deal with today. So hopefully that makes sense. I think that's all we've got. I know this is a longer one. I promise the other two won't be as bad. And hopefully we can discuss what I have here during our Zooms this week. All right. Take care. Oops. Okay. Well, false alarm. Um, so, I mean, this kind of just goes into everything I was saying, right? Less opportunities for people without skills, filling the inner cities, creating more poverty and less wealth. I think